Hey, I'm Daniel. I spent 20 years as a professor of religious history. Then I discovered something that cost me my career, but I couldn't keep it to myself. What Spinoza found, it changes everything you think you know.
For 18 years, Jesus disappears from every gospel. Not a word, not a single verse. The most written about man in human history vanishes between the ages of 12 and 30. And in 1894, a man walked into a Tibetan monastery and claimed he found the answer. That answer was suppressed within 12 months, and the reason it was suppressed is not what you expect. Right. Let me be clear about what we are dealing with. Open your Bible to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 41 to 52. There you will find the last recorded event of Jesus' youth. He is 12 years old. His parents have taken him to Jerusalem for the Passover. They lose him in the crowd. They search for 3 days. They find him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And everyone who heard him was astonished at his understanding and his answers. That is the last thing any gospel tells you about Jesus until he is approximately 30 years old. Now turn to Luke chapter 3, verse 23. Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age. That is the next verse. 18 years, compressed into silence. No birth record, no travel document, no letter, no mention by any contemporary historian, nothing. The official answer, if you can call it that, comes from a single verse in Mark, chapter 6, verse 3. The people of Nazareth see Jesus teaching, and they say, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joses, and Judas, and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us?" That Greek word, tekton, means something broader than carpenter. It means builder, craftsman, someone who works with his hands. And the people who say this are surprised that a local craftsman is suddenly teaching with authority. But before I show you what was found in that monastery, I need to show you why so many people refuse to accept this silence. Because the gap is uncomfortable. 18 years of the most important life in Western history, and no one wrote a word. That emptiness has been haunting scholars and seekers for centuries. And in 1894, someone claimed to have filled it. His name was Nicolas Notovitch, a Russian journalist, born in 1858 of Crimean Jewish origin, later converted to Russian Orthodox Christianity. He was a war correspondent by trade, not a scholar, not an archaeologist, a journalist with a talent for sensational stories. According to his account, in 1887, Notovitch traveled to Ladakh in northern India, near the Tibetan border. He claimed that while riding through the mountains, he fell from his horse and broke his leg. He was carried to the Buddhist monastery of Hemis, near the town of Leh, to recover. Hemis is one of the largest and wealthiest monasteries in Ladakh. It sits at 3,600 meters altitude, about 45 kilometers south of Leh. A real place. You can visit it today. And this is where it gets interesting. While recuperating, Notovitch claimed the monks showed him an ancient manuscript. The title, as he recorded it, was "The Life of Saint Isa, Best of the Sons of Men." Isa is the Arabic and Islamic name for Jesus. The manuscript, he said, was written originally in Pali and had been translated into Tibetan by Buddhist lamas. It consisted of 14 chapters and approximately 224 short verses, and what the manuscript described changed everything I thought I knew. Or so I believed at the time. I need to tell you something personal here. I first encountered Notovitch's book during my years at Durham. A colleague sent it to me through the post. A thin paperback yellowed cover, the spine cracked from being read too many times. There was a post-it stuck to the front. "Have you seen this?" "Thought of you." I started reading it that evening in my room, under the desk lamp, the shadows from the brass fittings stretching across the wall. I did not stop until 3 in the morning. The manuscript described Jesus leaving Israel at the age of 13. He joined a caravan of merchants heading east. By 14, he had reached Sindh, what is now Pakistan, then through Punjab, across Rajputana, to a place called Jagwernat, which scholars identified as Jagannath Puri in Orissa. The white priests of Brahma, according to the text, welcomed him joyfully. They taught him to read the Vedas, to cure by prayer, to drive out evil desires. But here is where the manuscript becomes extraordinary. Jesus lived among the lowest castes, the Vaisyas and the Sudras. He taught them the Holy Scriptures, and the Brahmins were furious. The Sudras were forbidden even to look at the Vedas. Jesus, this young Israelite, was breaking the entire social order. He denied the divine origin of the Vedas. He denied the Hindu Trinity. The Brahmins resolved to kill him. Warned by the Sudras, he fled by night. He spent 6 years wandering through holy cities, Benares, Rajagriha, then north into Nepal, into the Himalayas, where for 6 more years he studied Buddhist scriptures, then through Persia and back to Israel. He returned at the age of 29. I traced the route on a wall map that night in Durham, took a marker and drew the line: Israel to Sindh, Sindh to Punjab, south to Puri, north to Benares, into the mountains, through Persia, back. It was a plausible route, a merchant's route. The Silk Road had been active for centuries. My hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, from the weight of what I thought I was holding. If any of this were true, it would rewrite the history of Christianity. It would mean Jesus was trained not just in Jewish law, but in Vedic philosophy and Buddhist ethics. It would explain the parallels between his teachings and Eastern thought. It would fill the silence. In 1894, Notovitch published his book, La vie inconnue de Jésus-Christ, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ. It was an international sensation, translated into English, German, Spanish, Italian. It sold enormously. The idea captured something deep in people, the need for the story to be bigger, grander, more connected than what the Gospels offer. But there is a reason this manuscript disappeared from serious discussion, and it is not the reason you would expect. It was not the church that buried it, it was scholars. And what they found was devastating. The first to respond was Max Müller, not a priest, not a theologian, an Orientalist, the most distinguished scholar of Eastern languages and philosophy at Oxford University, a man who had spent his life studying Sanskrit, Vedic texts, and comparative religion. If anyone would have been sympathetic to the idea of Jesus studying in India, it was Müller. In October 1894, Müller published a refutation in the 19th Century Journal, Volume 36, page 515. The title was direct: The Alleged Sojourn of Christ in India. His arguments were precise. First, every genuine Tibetan Buddhist text is catalogued in 2 comprehensive collections, the Kanjur and the Tanjur. Every sutra, every commentary, every devotional text. The life of Saint Isa appears in neither. Second, Müller contacted an English woman who had visited Hemis Monastery. The abbot told her plainly that there was not a single word of truth in the whole story. No Western visitor had come to the monastery in 15 years. Third, Notovitch had conveniently lost the photographs of his expedition. Now listen carefully, because what happens next is what I am showing you now. Not just one man's hoax, something deeper. How easily we accept evidence when it tells us what we want to hear. In 1895, a professor named J. Archibald Douglas traveled to Hemis Monastery specifically to investigate. Douglas taught English and history at the government college in Agra, India. He was a careful man, a methodical man, and what he found dismantled Notovitch's story piece by piece. At the hospital in Leh, Douglas discovered that Notovitch had been treated for a toothache. Not a broken leg, a toothache. At Hemis Monastery, Douglas interviewed the head lama. This man had served in his position for 42 years. He was categorical. Notovitch never gained entrance to the monastery. No such manuscript existed. No such text had ever been part of their collection. When portions of Notovitch's book were read aloud to the head lama, his response was recorded by Douglas and published in the 19th century. It was reported by the New York Times on the 19th of April, 1895. The head lama's words were, "Lies, lies, lies, nothing but lies, nothing." Under pressure from Müller's attack, Notovitch revised his story. In his 1895 edition, he retreated. He claimed he had merely assembled material from fragmentary notices scattered among many Tibetan scrolls. This directly contradicted his original testimony of a coherent 2-volume manuscript shown to him by monks. And then came the confession. According to Douglas T. McGetchen, in his scholarly work Indology, Indomania, and Orientalism, published in 2010, page 133. Faced with this cross-examination, Notovitch confessed to fabricating his evidence. The journalist had invented the entire thing. I remember the night I found Douglas's article. 3 weeks after I had traced that route on the map, I was in the library at Durham, looking for supporting material for what I thought was going to be an important discovery. I found the volume of the 19th century on a bottom shelf, dusty, clearly not read in years. I opened it standing up, right there by the stacks, read Douglas's account, the toothache, the 42-year lama. Lies, 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 nothing but lies. My hands went cold. I sat down on the floor between the shelves, reread the whole article, checked the dates. Douglas had gone personally. He had spoken to the man in charge. Notovitch had lied about the leg. He had lied about the manuscript. He had lied about everything. I went back to my room. The map was still on the wall. The route I had traced in marker 3 weeks earlier, Israel to India to Tibet and back. I looked at it for a long time. Then I took it down, folded it, put it in the drawer. That night, alone in that room in Durham, I learned something that Spinoza had written 3 centuries before. Never trust an intermediary. Go to the sources yourself. Verify everything. That lesson, learned through the pain of being deceived, shaped everything I did afterward. Everything. But here is what even the debunkers did not expect. The legend grew stronger. In 1922, 27 years after the fraud was exposed, a man named Swami Abhedananda traveled to Hemis. He was a direct disciple of Ramakrishna, a respected figure in Hindu spirituality. He went specifically to expose the claims as fraudulent. Instead, he claimed to have been shown a manuscript, 14 chapters, 224 verses, exactly what Notovitch had described. But Abhedananda could not read Tibetan. He relied entirely on the monk's interpretation. He published his account in Bengali in 1929. When one of his disciples later returned to ask about the documents, he was told they had disappeared. In 1925, Nicolas Roerich, a Russian painter and theosophist, traveled through Central Asia on a 4-year expedition. He recorded hearing oral legends about Isa throughout Ladakh, Xinjiang, and Mongolia. We heard several versions of this legend which has spread widely, he wrote, but Roerich was a theosophist with pre-existing beliefs in syncretic spirituality, and the oral legends he recorded had been circulating for decades after Notovitch's published book had introduced the idea. In 1984, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, leader of the Church Universal and Triumphant, a New Age religious movement, published The Lost Years of Jesus. She compiled Notovitch, Abhedananda, Roerich, and a 4th visitor, Elizabeth Kaspari, who came in 1939 and could not read the materials either. The book was published by her own organization's press. Robert M. Price of the Wester Institute explained the pattern clearly. Once Notovitch's book became famous, the story itself became a local legend. The monks learned to tell visitors what they wanted to hear. Each credulous visitor confirmed what the previous one had planted, a self-reinforcing cycle of wishful thinking. The Ahmadiyya tradition took it further. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, writing in 1899, claimed Jesus survived the crucifixion, traveled through Persia and Afghanistan, and reached Kashmir. The Rosa Bal shrine in Srinagar is said to contain his tomb. The grave's east-west orientation is consistent with Jewish, not Islamic burial customs, but the shrine's own caretakers reject the identification with Jesus. And still the legend persists. Not because the evidence is strong. The evidence is non-existent. It persists because the need is strong. 18 years of silence in the life of the most important figure in Western religion. That emptiness is unbearable for many people. It is easier to fill it with an adventure across the Himalayas than to sit with the quiet fact that no one wrote anything down. The lie we want to hear always travels faster than the truth that makes us uncomfortable. But now I need to show you something that complicates this story, something real. Because the parallels between the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the Buddha are not imagined. They are documented. They have been studied by serious scholars. And they are remarkable. The Golden Rule. Jesus in Luke chapter 6, verse 31, "Do to others as you would have them do to you." The Buddha in the Dhammapada, chapter 10, verse 1. Consider others as yourself. On overcoming hatred. Jesus, Luke 6:27. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. The Buddha, Dhammapada 1:5. Hatred never ceases by hatred in this world. By love alone is hatred ceased. On retaliation. Jesus, Luke 6:29. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. The Buddha, Majjhima Nikaya 21:6. If anyone should give you a blow with his hand, with a stick, or with a knife, you should abandon any desires and utter no evil words. On wealth. Jesus, Matthew 19:24. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. The Buddha, Dhammapada 15:4. Let us live most happily, possessing nothing. Let us feed on joy, like the radiant gods. Marcus Borg compiled more than 100 such parallels in his book, Jesus and Buddha, The Parallel Sayings. Burnett Hillman Streeter of Oxford wrote that the moral teaching of Buddha has a remarkable resemblance to the Sermon on the Mount. These parallels are real, they are documented, but they do not mean what the legend seekers want them to mean, and this is where most people stop thinking. The Buddha taught 500 years before Jesus. The Silk Road connecting East and West had been active for centuries before either of them. Ideas traveled along those routes. Merchants carried them, scholars carried them. But more importantly, any human being who reflects seriously on suffering, compassion, and the nature of kindness arrives at similar conclusions. The Golden Rule appears independently in Confucianism, in Hinduism, in ancient Egyptian wisdom literature, in Greek philosophy. It is a human insight, not the property of any single tradition. And the differences between Jesus and the Buddha are far more revealing than the similarities. Buddhism has no personal God, no immortal soul, no concept of sin in the way Judaism or Christianity understand it. The Buddha taught anatta, the doctrine of no self, which is the opposite of everything Jesus taught about the individual soul standing before God. As one scholar put it, if Jesus studied Buddhism in India, he was a remarkably inattentive student. Marcus Borg himself noted something else. There is a social and political passion in Jesus not found in the Buddha. Jesus challenged the domination system of his day. He confronted the temple authorities. He was executed as a political threat. The Buddha lived to old age, teaching peacefully for decades. The difference in their fates tells you about the difference in their missions. Similarity is not evidence of contact, and the differences are far more revealing than the resemblances. Now, let me take you back to the silence, because now we have cleared the ground. The Tibetan manuscript was a fraud. The legend perpetuates itself through wishful thinking. The parallels are real, but explained by universal human ethics, not by travel. So what do we actually know about those 18 years? 1 verse. 6 words in Greek. Mark chapter 6, verse 3. Is not this the carpenter? And here is what those 6 words tell you, if you read them the way Spinoza taught us to read. The people of Nazareth are surprised. They know Jesus. They have known him for years. He is the local craftsman, the builder, the man who works with his hands. And when he begins teaching with authority, they are astonished. Where did this man get these things? If Jesus had spent 16 years studying in India and Tibet, his neighbors would not be surprised. They would say, "Ah, yes, he went away to study. He came back learned." But they do not say that. They say the opposite. They say, "Is this not the carpenter? Is this not Mary's son?" They are shocked that a man they knew as a worker is suddenly teaching like a rabbi. Their surprise is the evidence that Jesus was there in Nazareth working as a craftsman during those years, not in the Himalayas, not in Benares, in a workshop, with wood and stone and sweat. Years later, when I was teaching in Norwich, a mature student raised his hand during a seminar on the Synoptic Gospels. He was a retired man, 60-something, who had enrolled out of curiosity. He asked, "Professor, what about the years in India? Is there not a manuscript that proves Jesus studied with the Buddhists?" I paused. I recognized in his face the same excitement I had felt 20 years earlier in Durham, the same hope that the puzzle had a secret piece, the same desire for the story to be bigger than what the texts give us. I explained Notovitch. I explained Douglas. I explained the confession. I watched his face change, not to sadness exactly, to something worse, the resignation of a man losing a beautiful story. After the seminar, he stayed behind, approached me, said, "But surely the parallels between the Buddha and Jesus mean something." I looked at him. "They mean that compassion is universal, not that one man taught it to the other." He nodded slowly, left. I stood alone in the seminar room, the afternoon light coming through the high windows, the dust in the air catching the light. And I thought about how human it is, this need for the story to connect everything, to leave no gaps, to explain every silence. But Spinoza taught us something different. He wrote in the Tractatus that the method of interpreting Scripture does not differ from the method of interpreting nature. It is almost the same. You examine the text, you note what it says, you note what it does not say, and you ask, why? The Gospels are not biographies, they never were. They are theological arguments. Mark wrote for persecuted Christians in Rome. Matthew wrote for Jewish converts. Luke wrote for educated Gentiles. John wrote for communities in conflict with local synagogues. None of these audiences needed to know what Jesus did at the age of 22. None of them cared whether he was a good carpenter or an average one. Once you see the Gospels as arguments rather than biographies, you cannot unsee it. Every miracle, every genealogy, every contradiction becomes a clue, not to what happened, but to what the author was trying to convince you of. Compare this with Moses. In the book of Exodus, Moses kills an Egyptian, flees to Midian, and disappears for 40 years. 40 years in the desert, tending sheep. No one writes adventure stories to fill those 40 years. No one claims Moses traveled to China or studied with Zoroastrian priests. The silence is accepted as a narrative convention. The author cared about the Exodus, not about sheep. But with Jesus, the silence is unbearable. Because the modern mind demands a complete biography, we want the childhood, the formative years, the gap year abroad. We project our expectations onto a text that was never written to satisfy them. Other legends fill the same gap. In England, there is a story that Joseph of Arimathea brought the boy Jesus to Cornwall and Glastonbury, a legend introduced by Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould in 1899. William Blake immortalized the idea in his poem, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green?" Beautiful poetry, no evidence. In Shingo village in northern Japan, a man claimed in 1935 to have found the tomb of Jesus. According to the Takeuchi documents, universally considered a hoax, Jesus came to Japan at 21, studied for 12 years, and returned to Judea. His brother Isukiri took his place on the cross. Jesus escaped to Japan, changed his name, married, fathered 3 daughters, and lived to 106. The village now holds an annual Christ festival and attracts 40,000 tourists a year. In 1908, Levi Dowling published the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ, claiming to have transcribed it from the Akashic records during early morning meditation. Jesus travels through India, Tibet, Persia, Greece, and Egypt. The book contains numerous historical anachronisms. It has gone through more than 70 editions. Every one of these legends fills the same emptiness. Everyone responds to the same need. But the emptiness is not a problem to be solved. It is an answer to be read. The authors of the Gospels told us exactly what they considered important. The baptism, the temptation, the teaching, the miracles, the trial, the death, the resurrection. These were their arguments. The 18 years of carpentry in Nazareth were not part of the argument. Not because they were hidden, because they were irrelevant to the point being made. Spinoza saw this 3 centuries before modern scholarship caught up. He wrote that the apostles used natural reason, not divine revelation. They were human authors with human purposes. And the silence about 18 years is a purpose. It says, the private life of Jesus was not the point. The message was the point. The kingdom of God was the point. Notovitch wanted to fill the silence. Spinoza taught us to read it. The gap is not a cover-up. The gap is the answer. I spent years looking for what filled those 18 years. I traced routes on maps. I followed leads through libraries. I believed for 3 weeks in Durham that a Russian journalist had found something extraordinary. What I found instead was more valuable. The courage to accept what the silence tells us. The Gospels are not hiding Jesus' years in Tibet. They are telling you as clearly as they can that this was never meant to be a biography. It was a proclamation, and the 18 years of silence are the clearest proof of that. If you came to this video hoping the Tibet story was true, I understand. I hoped the same thing once. There is nothing wrong with wanting the story to be bigger, more extraordinary, more connected. But the truth, in its quiet way, is bigger than any legend. Because the truth tells you something not just about Jesus, but about the texts themselves. About what they are. About what they were always meant to be. And once you see that, you read everything differently. Seriously. Thank you for staying until the end. I know your time is valuable. I hope this serves some purpose in your life. Take care of yourselves.
If you're watching this, maybe you felt something isn't right about what you were taught. The stories don't add up. The history doesn't match. I've been there, and Spinoza gave me the answers. Stay with me to the end.